Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Kahn, and today we are recording a special summer short episode in honor of Tu B'Av, the 15th day of Av, which has been repurposed, Talli, in modern Israel as Yom Ha'ava, the day of love, which might be ironic or strange since our sources don't even mention love in conjunction with Tu B'Av at all. But we'll talk about that too. What's on our agenda today, Talli?
Well, I'd really like to hear from you about the original sources around Tu B'Av and maybe hear how it became known as the holiday or the festival of love. And since it has become kind of like the modern holiday of love in Israel, and we have a lot of listeners who don't live in Israel, so I think it might be of interest to know that Tu B'Av here is kind of like Valentine's Day in America. I think it might be a nice opportunity to talk about love, to talk about what romantic love is all about. It's not going to be a long episode, but maybe just some points about what you're going to bring in the texts, and then kind of talk about what's similar and what's different today.
Okay, it sounds good. Every year, Talli, we do these special bonus summer episodes. So I guess this is our annual tradition, and we'll get to that in a moment. First, check out the website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a Freeman's Mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon, Audible, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Remember to rate and review and leave a comment as well. Tell people about Intimate Judaism and share this podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Support Intimate Judaism by signing up for Patreon by going to patreon.com/intimatejudaism. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. If it's okay with you, Talli, I'd like to open up this episode today by reading the primary source that talks about Tu B'Av, which is a Mishnah in Masechet Ta'anit in the 4th Perek, the 8th Mishnah. It also appears in the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, Daf Kafav Amud Bet, page 26b.
And we'll have those sources in our show notes.
The Mishnah opens like this. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael, kachamisha asar ba'av uchayom haKippurim. There were no festive days in Israel like the 15th day of Av, that's Tu B'Av, and like Yom Kippur. Shabahen benot Yerushalayim yotzot bichlei lavan she'ulin. On those days, the daughters of Jerusalem would go out wearing borrowed white clothing. Shelo levayesh et mi she'ein lo. The reason it was borrowed was that way someone who didn't have it would not be embarrassed. Kol hakelim tunin tefillah. All of these clothes, this is in the days when purity and impurity was an operative factor in day-to-day life, required dunking in a mikveh. Uvenot Yerushalayim yotzot v'cholot bakramim. And these daughters of Jerusalem would go out and dance in the vineyards. Umeh hayu omrot. What would they say? Bachor. They would say, young man. They were speaking, the Braita tells us, to men who were not married, who were looking for a wife. Sa na einecha ura'eh. Lift up your eyes and look. Ma ata borer lach. What are you choosing for yourself? Al titein einecha banoi. Don't look at beauty. Tein einecha b'mishpacha. Give attention or put your eyes towards the family. Sheker hachein v'hevel hayofi isha yirat Hashem hi titalal. Grace is a lie and beauty is vanity. A woman who fears God, she is the one who should be praised. The Gemara expands upon this a bit. The Gemara talks about how there were other things that they would say. The people who were beautiful would say, don't look at anything except for beauty, because that's why you marry somebody. And the people who came from a good family would say, don't look at anything except for the family, because you want to have children from a miyuchas family, from a notable family, etc. So obviously this Mishnah is a short version of a much longer process. It's fascinating, especially, by the way, Talli, we talk about Tu B'Av. This also happened on Yom Kippur. That also is a major important point. Before we talk about what all this means, and there's a lot to say about it, there's a lot that's mysterious about it, let me first say why Tu B'Av, why the 15th of Av. The Gemara talks about it here in Masechet Ta'anit, as well as in Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kuf Kaf Aleph, page 121. And there are 6 reasons given for the celebration of Tu B'Av. Why this day? The first reason is because that's the day, according to tradition, that those who were fated and destined to die in the desert after the sin of the Meraglim, the spies, that's the day they stopped dying. On the 15th of Av. That was the day they realized that they were no longer dying in the desert, and everyone who had survived was going to go into the land of Israel. The second reason is that Tu B'Av was the day that tribes were allowed to marry each other. The 12 tribes were given permission to marry each other regardless of the circumstances. Let me give just a little bit of background. When the Bnot Slavchad, the daughters of Slavchad, approached Moshe and said they have no brothers and therefore they would like to inherit the land, God said they are speaking properly. From there we learn the laws of inheritance. The laws of inheritance according to the Torah are that sons inherit their father and daughters do not unless there is no son, in which case the daughters inherit. On the other hand, husbands inherit the property of their wives. After the Bnot Slavchad approached Moshe and were given permission to inherit their father's land in the future land of Israel, the tribe of Manasseh approached Moshe and said this is a problem because if they marry somebody from another tribe, then the inheritance will go to that other tribe, either through the children who are members of the father's tribe or through her husband. God responded that Manasseh is right as well, which means that if a daughter inherits her father, in that case, she can only marry somebody from her own tribe so as not to reduce the inheritance of any given tribe. On Tu B'Av, this law, this restriction was lifted and anybody from any tribe could marry anyone from any other tribe. The third reason is somewhat similar or parallel to what we just mentioned. In Sefer Shoftim, it tells us about Pilegesh Begiva, this incident involving Shevet Binyamin, after which the tribe of Benjamin was effectively ostracized and no one from any of the other tribes was allowed to marry anyone from Binyamin. That was lifted on Tu B'Av, and the tribe of Benjamin was allowed to marry people in Israel once again. The fourth reason is that in the time of Yeravam ben Nevat, this is when the 10 tribes split from Judah. At that time, Yeravam ben Nevat, who was an evil king, set up roadblocks to make sure that no one could go from Yisrael, the 10 tribes, to Yerushalayim on the festivals. And that at a certain point, Hoshea ben Elah took down those roadblocks, thereby intermingling the tribes again and allowing people to go back and forth to Yerushalayim. That happened on Tu B'Av. The next reason is that the dead of Beitar was a very large city. It's the seat of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135. In that year, they were destroyed and massacred by the Romans. The Gemara said there was so much blood. The blood ran from Beitar all the way to the sea, and that horses were up to their nostrils in blood. Obviously, these are exaggerations, but it means it was a terrible massacre. And afterwards, to add insult to this terrible injury, the people weren't allowed to bury the dead. That decree of the Romans not allowing them to bury the dead was lifted on Tu B'Av. And the final reason is one which is much less dramatic than the other ones, although there's lots to say about this as well, which is that they used to cut the wood in the summer for the Mizbeach, for the Baracha, and the day that they would stop doing that was on Tu B'Av. All right, we don't have to get into all of these different ideas, but I thought that's an important historical background to what Tu B'Av represents. I'd like to ask you, Talli, in just a moment about the idea of love, and obviously these are just sources which we can interpret in so many different ways. In a short episode, we're not going to do them justice. But I would like to emphasize 3 points that emerged from that Mishnah that I saw, and you can comment on that perhaps if you find reason to do so. The first one is going back to that idea where the girls would dance out in the vineyards. Attraction matters. We are not saying that just choose someone randomly. They say, boys, lift up your eyes and see what you're seeing. You have to be attracted to the person whom we want to marry. The second point is that attraction isn't everything. They then say, after that, don't only look at attraction. In fact, they say don't look at attraction at all, but that's after you already are watching the girls dancing. They say there are other things, whether it's the family or various other factors that might be a different reason that one would marry somebody. And the third point, which gets back to Yom HaAhava, and with this I'll turn it over to you, Talli, love is not mentioned over here. I don't know exactly why love isn't mentioned, but love is not part of this conversation at all. It doesn't say fall in love. I think that relates to the idea of what love means, or at least the word ahava, the Hebrew word love, means in Jewish sources. The first time we see a husband and a wife love each other in the Torah is Yitzchak and Rivka. And the way that the Pasuk presents it, this is at the end of Parshat Chayei Sarah, it says, Vayiviyeh Yitzchak Oela, Sarah imo. Yitzchak brought Rivka into the tent of his mother Sarah. Vayikach et Rivka. He took Rivka, Vatilo Leisha. She became his wife, Vayehaveha. And he loved her. And the order might be important. Love is something which might develop over time. I don't mean that no one can fall in love in advance, but that might be what we call puppy love. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe I'm wrong. But this deep, abiding love, the kind of love that actually lasts, is something which develops over time. Yitzchak didn't fall in love with Rivka and then marry her. He married her and he loved her. And I think the order might be significant. I don't know how that jives with the way you see things or the way that modern psychology sees things at all, but I wonder if that's what the Torah is telling us. Now, in fairness, Yaakov loved Rachel before he married her, so it's not as though this is universally true in all cases, but certainly the first time love appears in a marriage in the Torah, it happened after the marriage took place, and maybe that relates to why we are not told about love when you're looking for a girl to find when she's dancing in the vineyards. That's something that I noticed in this particular section, Talli.
Okay, well, thank you for giving us that historical background. And before I talk about love, I just want to comment or maybe even question a little bit about the historical background. I think even today, there's a lot of ways to relate to the idea of joy and love and comfort. This was a very difficult period, the 3 weeks and then the 9 days and Tisha B'Av. It's a very hard time. And even today, we do the best we can to remember and to be in this state of mourning. And when we read Eicha and when we read the keynote, there is a lot of this reference to the rupture of the relationship between Israel and God, this kind of betrayal of God, going to other gods, and God being very upset at Sion and Sion being also angry and upset at God. And this whole kind of
God
rupture.
betraying Sion too from its perspective.
Yeah. So I think that historically, this idea of celebrating with Tu B'Av, which has a lot of elements of vitality, of repair. They stop dying in the desert. I mean, that to me is the opposite of death and grief, but it's building, it's repair. The tribes now can intermarry. That also kind of reflects a certain freedom, a certain openness, a certain ability to, not have these roadblocks. We were talking about roadblocks, which, roadblocks also kind of brings up, the siege and all the different ways in which we were prevented from reaching God, reaching this relationship. God help me, I can't figure out the not cutting the wood for the Mizbeach, like what that has to do with anything. But
right, that seems to be the odd man out over here.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out something for that.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you one thing about that. It is often commented by some of the Mefarshim that it means that the nights are going to get longer, and now there's more time to stay home and learn Torah. That's what some say.
Okay, so the learning of the Torah, what happened in Beitar, the idea of vitality and growth and repair and love, kind of as a juxtaposition to what we experienced with destruction and with a rupture in the relationship and with grief. So I kind of think that might give this whole thing a deeper meaning, because love has with it a lot of possibilities. The whole idea of love is potential. So this whole idea of the development of the potential for romantic love relationship.
I wanted to ask you about that too, actually, now that you're mentioning that. And if we're going to go in that direction, this idea of freedom is very much implicit in almost all of these. Again, the wood for the Ma'aracha, perhaps that's maybe different, but the idea of freedom, but not just freedom. Also, these are not days that, if I were to look at them objectively, are joyous. It's when something bad stopped. In other words, the people who were killed can be buried. The people who were dying in the desert stopped dying. This is not when there was a decree of life. It's rather when the decree of death ended. It's when a bad decree from Yeravam that you can no longer go to Yerushalayim ended. And it's almost like, if I want to connect this to Yom Kippur is about breaking the bonds that hold us back from what we want to be. It's a new start, but it's a new start by saying the past is past and now I can move forward with a fresh slate. In the same way, on some national level, I think Tu B'Av represents there are certain things holding us back. You're in the desert, you're going to die here. Well, actually you're not. Saying you're not going to die means I can move forward. Now the Shvatim are no longer limited in who they can marry. You can move forward. Binyamin is no longer ostracized. It gives us more freedom of who is available that we're allowed to marry, bringing us together. It takes away some of these boundaries that might have been holding us back, giving us that freedom and enabling us to move forward, just like Yom Kippur.
Yeah, I think even literally when you were reading the Mishnah, it did bring these kind of images that reminded me of Shirat Hayam, something about the Mechalot and the Kramim and, Shirat Devorah, anything that has to do with happiness and joy and potential and something that feels more free. And this idea of women dancing and the women wearing white dresses and dancing and going up to the Bachurim and speaking to them. I guess, we've gotten firmer over time because
Yeah.
in some
I'm not sure it'd go
communities
over
that
so
was,
well nowadays. Yeah.
yeah, so I guess those were the days. The idea that you said before also that attraction matters, but that attraction isn't everything. And I think this is really an opportunity to talk about, modern love in ancient times or ancient love in modern times. How do
Either
we,
way.
yeah, I think that what we glean from the sources, and we see this in Shir HaShirim, and we see this over and over, that there are a lot of allegories to the relationship with God. And this may, in some ways, be one of them, or it may be a historical. It's summer. It's the time. I believe I read somewhere that it's also the time of the harvests of the grapevines. So there's a reason for being out there in the vineyards.
Interesting.
But there is something very romantic about vineyards anyway. So it's a romantic day, and it's, on the one hand, very, very commercialized. And on the other hand, there's something about living in Israel where there are Jewish textual sources for even national holidays, not necessarily religious holidays, that feels, kind of nice. So
Right.
let's talk about love.
Please. I guess I'd say that to the degree we're aping Valentine's Day, I'm not so into that. But on the other hand, as you said, a day that is based on Jewish textual sources, admittedly, it doesn't say the word love, but it's obviously a romantic day. I think that's probably a positive thing. So tell us about love, Talli. What, in terms of this Mishnah, speaks to you in terms of the way that we look at dating today? Is there something that you would take out of that that's relevant to us today?
Yeah, look, I think that one thing that speaks to me is this idea of, what it means when we kind of fall in love at first sight, when we're attracted, and what it means when we build a loving relationship. I think it's interesting. People don't know this necessarily, that there is a neurophysiology to love, that love has been studied, that there are scientists who study what happens in the brain when people fall in love, and that love is considered to have different stages to it. When I talk about love, or when I talk about the development of relationships, and we look at the development of relationships within our communities, there's going out on blind dates or shidduch dating. There's actually just organically falling in love. There's maybe having a good friend who you were friends with growing up and then falling in love. There are different patterns for this idea of developing a love relationship. When I started trying to understand more about love, one thing that I found very interesting was the triangle of love, the theory of love by Robert Sternberg, who is a psychologist who wrote about this in the 80s. And basically what he said is that love is comprised of three basic components. There's the first stage, which is passion, and then there's intimacy, and then there's commitment. So the way it works is that the first stage can last from, depending on what you will read in the data and the science of love, but the love, kind of that obsessive love, that idealism of love, my lover can do no wrong, the kind of love that is so strong in terms of the hormones of dopamine, of noradrenaline, of oxytocin, of serotonin, oxytocin being more about attachment. But the falling in love, the butterflies in the stomach, creates almost a situation where you are so much in your emotional brain, so much in your limbic system, that you're not even all that rational. MRIs of people in love, or PET scans rather, have shown very similar brains to people who have OCD, who are obsessed. People who are in love are obsessed. They say their lovers' names over and over. And that stage can last anywhere from 2 months to 2 years, sometimes even longer. But most people don't maintain, and I think for a good reason, that kind of passion, that kind of butterflies in the stomach. It's associated, obviously, also with, the stage of lust hormones, the testosterone and the estrogen. And in Western cultures, obviously, there's a great deal of sexual expression when that's not restricted by laws, religious laws. But the desire is there. Even if the behavior is restricted, the desire would be there. And so people do look for that. People do say after several years of marriage, why don't I have that feeling anymore? And not having that feeling anymore often makes them feel like there's something wrong with them, that they've fallen out of love. But in fact, that's not necessarily what happens. What happens is that we kind of enter into I would say, a deeper stage which is coming out of the passion stage, but going more into the intimacy stage, which is really where we become more authentic. Because when we're in that idealized love stage, there's often we're wearing our masks. We bring our best selves to one another, and we don't necessarily see each other in different kind of settings and different emotional experiences, grief, loss, anger, frustration. So when we get to the intimacy stage, we kind of really get to know each other better. Maybe, he'll come over when you're sick and bring you soup and you're in your sweats with a runny nose. You're no longer always putting your best face on, or you're on a trip and he lost the way or has a flat tire and he's very frustrated and kicking the tire. He's no longer in his best self that he brings all the time. And yet that's okay, because you're in this deeper stage where you really do get to know each other better. You really do understand each other better. You accept one another. You see one another in all different kinds of authentic ways in which you show up. And then, assuming you still like each other, once you've gotten past that stage, you go into the commitment stage. So again, in the Western world, it might take a while before a couple might decide to get married. If they're living together for several years, there might not be a need to do that, or maybe they'll do that when they're ready to have children. Certainly in Israel, secular couples will often live together until they're ready to have kids, and then they'll get married. Whereas religious couples may get married much sooner, even before they've really even entered into the intimacy stage. And so that's something that is anticipated to happen. I heard a joke once that in the Western society, it's like passion and then intimacy and then commitment. In the Haredi world, it's commitment and then passion and then intimacy. And in modern Orthodox, it's, I don't know, what was it? It was intimacy and then commitment and then passion, or something like that. So I think that kind of we can anticipate all elements of all of these things throughout our life. And just to put that in there real quick is that one of the things that people will come to therapy most often for is, how do we recapture the butterflies in the stomach? How do we recapture that passion, that desire that we had in the beginning? And, much of the secret to doing that is through really enhancing the intimacy of your relationship. We talk about that a lot, actually, in the book that I wrote together with Dr. David Ribner. That's really a guide to enhancing intimacy for married couples.
I am for my beloved.
I am for my beloved. And it's really a guide to kind of, how do you keep that passion alive in a long-term monogamous marriage? And if you wait until the end of this episode, I'm going to give you a coupon code, because for Tu B'Av, we are actually running a special. I don't know exactly what the percentage is off, but it's a nice sale if you order through our publishers or in publication.
Talli, I heard the comedian Paul Reiser talk about marriage in terms of what you're describing as the intimacy stage or the commitment stage. And he quotes a husband saying to his wife, "You know what? Now that we're married, let's be ourselves." And the wife will say, "You know what? Let's not," because you don't necessarily want to find out all of the things about your partner that you've each hidden from each other until this point, perhaps with very good reason. Let's get back to the passion stage. I want to ask a question about that. What does one do when you say you want to recreate that passion, given that the passion is based on something which is kind of fake? In other words, if you're putting your masks on, if it's based on butterflies of the stomach, you don't really know each other so well. Maybe I'm wrong in saying this. I wonder if it's sometimes you're projecting your emotional needs on the other person rather than allowing the person to truly be who he or she actually is. In that case, even though, of course, people want to re-establish that passion, but is it even possible in a real way, because the passion is based on perhaps a type of falsehood?
It's interesting. I don't think it's so much about being fake. I think it's really about just being driven by what that dopamine pleasure-seeking drive is about. It's really about this feeling of vitality. It's about reward. I mean, dopamine is a reward system. It's really not about something very, very reflexive. People who are in love are not really thinking about things having to do with what's our house going to look like, how many kids are we going to have. They're really more into this idea of being seen, being wanted, seeking pleasure, seeking that feeling of attachment and excitement. that's really what it's about. And that's not something that is really sustainable in life over the long run. It's like, every once in a while we go on vacation and we have a great time and our dopamine reward system is stimulated, but we don't go on vacation every single day of our life. We also have to live our life, be in our rational minds, and, go to work, make money, pay the bills, and have our feet on the ground. So it's really about being able to balance the feelings. We're not going to be what we were at 18, 19, 20, but it's really about being able to recapture the feeling. And so sometimes it's about going on vacation. It's about experiencing new things together. It's about, being motivated to go look to seek that drive and that reward system together in order to kind of re-trigger those feelings. But the intimacy stage is still going to be the gasoline. It's the oxytocin, the attachment hormones, the feeling safe, the feeling secure, the feeling that your partner has your back. Over the long run, they're far less risky. When you're in the love stage, you don't really, there's a lot of mystery. You're not even 100% sure that your partner, he loves me not. He loves me.
Meaning at the passion stage.
Yeah, that passion stage is what I meant. So that's part of what's exciting, but that's also not quite stable yet. And so when we're in the intimacy stage, we have this sense of security and safety and stability. And with it, we also want to try to recapture parts of what we may have had. And not everyone had that in the beginning of their relationship, but what we may have had in those initial stages of the relation, that kind of starry-eyed staring at each other's eyes and just being mesmerized by one another.
This might take us a bit off our topic, which is all about love and Tu B'Av. But when people, obviously, I don't want to be reductionist either, so let me be very careful here. But is it common for affairs to take place because people crave that passion stage and they don't find it in their commitment stage once they're already married? Is that a common reason that people stray outside their marriages?
Well, I think that one of the very common reasons that people stray is because there is a certain vitality that they may feel is missing. Sometimes there really is literally a missing vitality, the death of a parent or some kind of loss that triggers this need for oxygen, and they may look for it elsewhere. There's certainly a real dopaminergic kind of activity that triggers or that drives people who are engaged in infidelity, at least in the beginning of it. That's kind of one reason. I would refer our listeners to an episode that we did on infidelity. I don't remember what season, but we did speak about some of the different factors that can trigger the desire to look outside the marriage. And it's really another good reason to kind of affair safe or secure your marriage by making sure that you can, in however ways, and sometimes it's even with role play, you can keep that vitality going in your marriage, even if it's a very long-term monogamous marriage. And again, that's really the goal. That's what we wanted to do when we wrote the book, David Ribner and I, honoring the idea, especially in this culture that is moving away from monogamy towards ethical non-monogamy, towards many different models, polyamory, not the exact same thing as ethical non-monogamy. And it is definitely infiltrating our communities, by the way. And I am seeing it. I am seeing couples come into my office who are talking about opening up their marriages, and we could consider doing an episode about it. I think that if you were Tevye in this scenario, you would probably say there is no other hand. I would definitely agree with you on that from a values position.
On the other hand, putting our head in the sand isn't necessarily healthy or smart either.
Exactly. We do need to be aware that there is that kind of discourse that's out there.
I'll say one thing, and this is something which I thought about before. Perhaps I'm reading way too much into it, but I thought about the fact that in the Mishnah, when it talks about the dance, the concept of dance, I think of dance as sort of controlled chaos or controlled freedom, because on the one hand, they're dancing together, and in Jewish dance, very often people are in a circle. In fact, that Gemara in Tanit continues and talks about Olam Haba, when the tzaddikim dance around God and point to God, whatever that exactly means on a agadic level. But here, controlled chaos might be a metaphor in some level for what you're talking about in the triangle of love, when on the one hand, you need to have that passion, which is the chaos. But on the other hand, it has to be remaining within that intimacy and commitment, which is the control, which makes sure that it doesn't get out of hand. It doesn't turn into something else. Again, I might be reading way too much into it, but I was thinking about that before, and it dovetails nicely with what you're saying now.
an interesting metaphor.
Okay, Talli, this obviously is a short episode, and we're going to have a full season of Intimate Judaism coming up. Before we go, though, can you give that coupon code for I Am for My Beloved?
Yes. So we will put in the show notes 2 links, one to order the book in English, I Am for My Beloved, and one to order the book in Hebrew, Ani Ledodi. You can use the coupon code Beloved Promo, all in caps. We will also put that in the show notes. And I hope you will consider buying several copies. It's wedding season. Young couples are getting married, and also older couples may be getting married, and couples getting married for the second time around. I think that it's a nice gift to give your kids and to give to your friends. The sale is going to be going on for the next few days only.
Okay. And just by way of an unsolicited recommendation for Talli over here, a lot of people talk to us all the time about how beneficial this podcast is in opening up conversations. And I think in the same way, this book does the same thing in a written level. It talks about things that are too often ignored in the Orthodox community, talking about ways of developing intimacy, both emotionally and physically. It's an excellent book. It's a book that people should read, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you for the endorsement. Can I ask you, can you go on to Amazon and write a review? And any of our listeners who would also like to endorse the book on Amazon, we could use some positive reviews. David and I are both we're not millennials. We're not great at marketing. So please help us out.
I will do that today. And people listening to this podcast will be able to check if I actually follow through. Okay.
All right. Great. Yes.
All right,
and
great.
I will check too. Thanks
Good.
so much.
Please do so. All right. Thank you all for joining us. And remember, season 6 is coming up very, very soon. So stick around for more Intimate Judaism. Thanks for joining us, and happy Tu B'Av.
Bye.